quick note, next week, Margaret Williams,
Hi, everyone. This is
Senior
Karen.
Fellow in the
Don't
Harvard
forget that we are
Initiative at
recording.
Harvard Kennedy
All right,
School,
thanks.
and she was for 24 years the director of the World Wildlife Fund's U.S. Arctic program, and she did a lot of collaboration with Russia. And she's going to provide an overview of the unique resources, especially marine resources shared between Russia and Alaska. And she's a great speaker. She'll be coming in via Zoom from Harvard, and really recommend that. I think she'll do a great job. So are we ready to go? Okay. What? Yes, okay, we're recording. So no nasty comments unless you want to be attributed to those. But I think we're all set to go, and I've learned a few things about this pointer, so I'll see if it's going to work here. I have to figure out how to turn it on. Moses is, oh, I got it. Okay. So today we're going to talk about the Arctic research, the Arctic coastal slope and the various issues with oil and gas development, climate change, and conservation. And maybe we should go ahead and click out that bottom left-hand photo. That's right, because we've probably got some, there we go. Okay, this is an important map of the Arctic, starting from the Canadian border on the far right and moving through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and then the Prudhoe Bay area, and you can see the vertical red line, that's the Dalton Highway, from Fairbanks up to the coast, up to Prudhoe Bay, and then moving left, you have the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, and when you go from the Canadian border all the way to the Chukchi Sea, that's about 600 miles or so. So it's a long distance across. And you've got other areas, national parks and national preserves down to the south. The Arctic Refuge is the largest refuge in the United States. It's about 19.6 million acres. And then the National Petroleum Reserve is the largest block of public land in the United States at 23 plus million acres. And there's going to be a lot of interesting issues. That's Utqiagvik on the upper left. That used to be Barrow, and a population of a couple thousand, and then Kaktovik on the upper right, population of about 400, 500, and then Prudhoe Bay in the center, just to give you context of the North Slope. And this is the oil and gas infrastructure. Again, the Dalton Highway in the center going up north to Prudhoe Bay. And you can see the development has moved west. To the right of the slide would be the Arctic Refuge. And then you get into NPRA moving to the west. And this is really one of the, it's a huge development. It really affects about 1,000 square miles, and this is about twice the size of Los Angeles, city of Los Angeles. Now, this isn't all concrete like the city of Los Angeles, and we'll get into more of roads and pipelines and what they mean in terms of wildlife in a bit. Okay. This is a view of Prudhoe Bay area. I had lived in Alaska for 13 years before I ever got up to the Arctic coast. And I left Juneau, where I was a research biologist studying the Tongass, and moved up to Fairbanks, where I was a research supervisor for wildlife activity in interior and Arctic Alaska. And I flew the state beaver from Fairbanks up to Beaufort Lagoon on the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. And one of the flights, there were two of us that were pilots, and one of our flights was across the coastal plain over Prudhoe Bay. This was my first experience at Prudhoe Bay, and I was astonished at the amount of development. You know, living in Alaska for 13 years, I just had no comprehension of the network of roads and pipelines and so on. And we were flying at 500 feet, which you can't do anymore up there for security reasons. But it's a major development. Okay, I'm having difficulty because I'm wearing glasses and hearing aids and this microphone, and that's what happens when you get old, I guess. So now you can hear me okay there? All right, let's try it again and make sure that we are on. Moses, it should be working. I'm pushing the right thing, but it's not advancing. I think I've got bad luck. Okay. Okay, it's magic. This technology is challenging for me. Okay, we've got a double whammy in the Arctic when it comes to conservation. We've got climate change, and in the Arctic, the climate is getting warmer by about 4 times what it is in the global average. And this, plus the expansion of development, is creating some challenges for conservation. And I'm going to start out talking about polar bears. Polar bears, as you remember from our bear talk, are really creatures of the ice. They've evolved and adapted to life on ice. They feed primarily on marine mammals, spotted seals as their priority species, dead whales, beluga whales, other ice seals. And estimating populations is challenging for a number of reasons. One is that the ice today is getting much thinner and you can't land a helicopter on it. So biologists are really challenged trying to capture bears on the ice, where you run the risk of having your helicopter break through the ice. You don't want that to happen. So that's a problem. It's a problem for bears because they're really moving with the ice, and I'll get into more of that in a minute. But the Beaufort Sea population, the southern Beaufort Sea population that we share with Canada is about 900 bears. And the Chukchi Sea population that we share with Russia, roughly about 3,000 bears, but those numbers are hard to come by. So these are ballparks, so plus or minus. I'm going the wrong way, I think. Yep, there we go. I'm pushing the button. Okay. So polar bears were listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a threatened species, 10, 15 years ago. And the dark blue area represents critical habitat, and that's basically ice habitat where the polar bears are hunting. And then you see that brown area along the coast, that's terrestrial denning habitat. And then further in the Chukchi Sea, you've got barrier island habitat. Canada on the right and Russia on the left. And Margaret will talk about Russia and the fact that we haven't had any substantive professional scientific collaboration with Russia, since the Ukraine war. And this is really a problem. So as the ice recedes, on-land denning is becoming more and more common. And of course, that brings polar bears into conflict with people. And from our bear talk, you know, where you bring people and bears together, whether they're brown grizzly bears or black bears or polar bears, there are challenges because bears are threatening and bears often get killed. And occasionally bears kill a person. So Fish and Wildlife Service has raised concerns, especially on the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, where that's where the majority of land denning goes on. These are rolagons doing seismic exploration for oil, and they pass like 250 to 400 yards apart. If you're a denning polar bear, a female, and you have one of these things go over you, it's not a great thing. You're likely to abandon your den, and if you've got cubs in the den, they're dead because they can't survive without mom. So that's a challenge. Okay, now we're getting into climate change again. We talked about that in the very first session, and this shows the change in the extent of ice off the coast over from 1980 through 2024, and you can see a dramatic decline in Arctic sea ice extent. And it gets more interesting. So this came from the National Snow and Ice group, and this was put together by Rick Toman at the International Arctic Research Center at UAF, and you can see from 1979 to 89, this was the mean extent of the daily minimum ice. And you can see the ice sheet coming right down to the Beaufort Sea coast. And when I was up there doing the porcupine caribou census in '89, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, we could see ice. We were camped on the Beaufort Lagoon. And we could see ice right off. When we got up in the airplane, the ice was there. So then you look at the right picture, and this is interesting because this was last year, and this year is somewhat similar, but don't have the data, the graphic yet. But the 2023 minimum sea ice, September 19, from Kaktovik to the southern border of the ice was 270 miles away. That's remarkable. And what was that? Yeah. So you see that? It's hard for you to see it in the back of the room, but there's a little red line on the right from the sea ice extent to Kaktovik, the village of Kaktovik, 270 miles away. So this is having a tremendous impact on polar bears. The southern Beaufort Sea population of polar bears, I see Bob Waldrop there. Good to see you, Bob. And he and I were up in Kaktovik with some fellow biologists and friends photographing polar bears, 10 years ago or so. They don't have polar bear viewing up there anymore. But this picture was taken up there at that time. This is a mother bear with cubs. And a polar bear can swim 200 miles. Isn't that amazing? But when they're swimming these great distances, their body condition goes down. If they have cubs, the cubs they found they're dying of drowning. Their body condition declines. So the southern Beaufort Sea population of polar bears is actually on the decline as best that the biologists can tell. Another little interesting tidbit is that probably the best place to view polar bears, photograph polar bears in North America is Hudson's Bay. And now Hudson's Bay is ice-free in a good portion of the summer, and polar bear biologists are predicting that sometime in the 2030s, polar bears will be extirpated from Hudson's Bay because they can't make a living on ground, on land. You know, they don't eat sedges and roots and berries like grizzly bears do or black bears do. You know, they can eat birds' eggs and things like that, but they really can't make a good living on land. So these are creatures of the ice, eating marine mammals. So we can expect some significant challenges with polar bears, just from climate change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Arctic Refuge. And this is a picture my colleague Ken Whitten took back in the 80s, the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge looking at the Brooks Range. There are a lot of caribou there. Okay, so the Canada is on the far right, the Canadian border comes down, and that's the eastern border of the Arctic Refuge. And if you look along the coast, there's a little dotted line, and that's the 1002 area. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And further to the left, you see Prudhoe Bay and the Dalton Highway, and the brown area is the Brooks Range. Again, this is the largest national wildlife refuge in the United States. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read this. ANILCA, Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, in 1980, established the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with the purpose of protecting the wildlife, wilderness, and recreational values of the area. I don't think you can read that from the back of the room. However, it was left for Congress to decide whether to permit oil and gas development in the 1002 area of the refuge's coastal plain. And you saw where that was. In 2017, a provision of the tax cut bill, which Senator Murkowski worked on pretty diligently, and was signed by President Trump, mandated oil and gas leasing take place in the 1002 area of the refuge. Few bids were tendered for the first lease sale, and the big companies really stood back. It was very controversial. Getting finance and dealing with it was just apparently for ConocoPhillips and BP and those big companies, they didn't bid on these. Ada bid on them, Alaska Development and Export Authority. In 2023, the Biden administration canceled that first lease sale. There were supposed to be 2 lease sales, and okay. In 2007, okay, few bids were tendered, okay. Biden canceled the one in 2023. Having a hell of a time with this. Okay, here we go. Judge Gleason is currently considering whether the Biden administration's cancellation of the lease sale was legal. That was supposed to have been put out last week, last Friday. So I'm thinking that any day now we'll hear from her on that issue. And then last week, Ada, again, the Alaska agency, committed $20 million for the next lease sale, which is scheduled before the end of this year, so, you know, a couple months from now. That's to just give you, this is a very long-term controversial issue with people fighting hard on all sides. And, you know, the Gwich'in people south of the Brooks Range, or the people of the Caribou, the Koktovik village, and the Arctic Slope Region Corporation they're people of the marine mammals and the whale hunters, and they see great value in the economics of developing oil and gas. So there's kind of conflicting social views depending on where you live on the North Slope. And you know, of course, the environmental community has a position, and you know, the resource development industry has a position, but this has been with us for a long time. And I'm just trying to give you a little background. Now, this map, you've seen before, but there's an important factor here. Within the coastal plain and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the average distance between the foothills of the mountains and the coast is about 25 to 30 miles. In Prudhoe Bay, an area to the west, the distance is 75 to 100 miles. So the compression of the coastal plain in the Arctic Refuge is significantly more than it is where you have more room on the coastal plain in Prudhoe Bay and the National Petroleum Reserve. And I'll get more to that, but I just wanted to point that out. So this was 1989, and just moved to Fairbanks from Juneau, and I'm a pilot, so I joined Pat Valkenburg on the left, Ken Whitten and Howard Golden, long-term colleagues of mine, and I flew the Beaver up to the Arctic coastal plain, Beaufort Lagoon, and then Pat joined us, and Pat and I shared pilot responsibilities, and we did the 1989 porcupine caribou herd photo census. Big military camera in the belly of the airplane, and we'd fly transects. And we did this in early July when the caribou had already had their calves, and they were aggregating because of insects. And caribou are driven at this time of year by seeking out the best food with the least predation and the least amount of mosquitoes and estrid flies and bot flies, which drive them crazy. They drive us crazy too. So this is a photograph I took from about 500 feet out of the window of the Beaver, 35 millimeter photo that I scanned. And July 89, probably about the, I don't know, maybe the 10th of July or a little earlier. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And the population estimate from that photo census is at 178,000, and the current estimate is 218,000 for the porcupine caribou herd. There are 4 caribou herds on the North Slope. The porcupine herd in the Arctic Refuge, the Central Arctic herd around Prudhoe Bay, the Peshekbuk Lake herd over in NPRA just west of Utqiagvik, and then the Western Arctic herd. And the Western Arctic herd once numbered 500,000 animals. That herd has declined, and the porcupine caribou herd is now the largest herd in Alaska. And one of the largest, maybe the largest herd in North America. This is an older graphic that Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife Service put together, but it serves the purpose. And there's the coastal plain, the 1002 area, and the dark green patches are concentrated calving. Canada on the right of that red border line. The dotted line is the extent of calving, and the dark blue is the extent of concentrated calving. And so this is really important. And this shifts from year to year. Sometimes there's more calving across the border in Canada, but most of the time they're in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge. And when they're there, they seem to, their productivity is higher, more calves, less mortality. And I mentioned earlier, caribou at calving and post-calving are really driven by finding the highest quality vegetation. That's cotton grass. And they eat those little tips. It's full of protein and has very high nutritional value. And the caribou really focus their activities where this plant is in greatest abundance. They also eat a lot of lichens, and that's just been discovered using video cameras on caribou that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing in their research in the Arctic Refuge. They had a great presentation on that about a week ago. The other driver are predators. Grizzly bears, wolves, golden eagles to a small amount, and caribou try to avoid the highest density predators, which is kind of up in the foothills. And again, remember that concentration of that coastal plain that I talked about? So in the Arctic Refuge, those caribou are really compressed. In the Prudhoe Bay area in NPRA, there's a much more larger extent for finding food and finding areas that aren't full of a bunch of predators. When we did the coastal, the census in '89, it was cool. We saw grizzly bears around the perimeter. We saw wolves. I mean, it was, that one picture I showed you, I forgot to tell you, it was counted, and outside of the image of my picture, Fish and Game technicians counted 90,000 caribou. So we were looking at a herd of 90,000. And I've been to the Serengeti twice, and that's sort of like you see with wildebeest, although there's several million and they're much more broadly dispersed. But this is truly one of the great events in wildlife spectacles is the caribou. And the bare ground caribou make great movements in the porcupine caribou herd, can move up to 1,500 miles in migration, round trip. And some people think it's the largest land migration distance in the world. But it's big. I don't know about the world. Okay, now research by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Alaska Fish and Game has found some really interesting information. That's the pipeline, one of the feeder pipelines actually, and they found that cow-calf groups avoid oil field infrastructure on average by about 2.5 miles, a little band on either side of the pipeline. Not 5 miles, but 2.5 total. Now I'm going to point out, see those vertical columns? Those are called vertical support posts for the pipeline. Just think about that, because I'm going to come back to that in a couple of slides. Now the photograph, I took that photograph, that's a bull caribou. Bull caribou seem to be less impacted by pipeline infrastructure and roads than cows and calves. So 2.5 mile area is avoided. It's the oil field actual infrastructure is 2.5% of the area, but the avoidance zone is 29%. And larger groups and cow-calf groups are most affected by that. Now, here's some data from Fish and Game and the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Looking at the right, you see that light blue and you see the dark blue. Well, this was the concentrated calving area for the central Arctic caribou herd that overlaps oil development. And this was from 1980 to 1996. And then the left side, you can see the development. That's Prudhoe Bay and Kapparik. And early on, there was less development, and as development increased, you can see the food on the lower left graphic declined from the beginning of the measurements to the end. And to the right of the slide, to the east, where there was no development, the food quality and quantity remained about the same. And in The eastern portion that was adjacent to oil field development, weights of cows and the reproductive productivity declined in the west, where it was adjacent to the oil fields, compared to the east, where it didn't have any oil field infrastructure. And more recent information suggests that this is basically the pattern. Now, again, this is the porcupine caribou herd distribution in the coastal plain. There's a lot of caribou herd, and they're all scrunched in this condensed area. Now, this slide from the back is going to be hard to see, but the outline of the 1002 area is in red, and those black, straight, angled lines are pipelines and roads, and then the drill pad area. The tan area is Kaktovik, that's native corporation land. But you can see the red perimeter. This is the coastal plain, and you can see that 2,000 acres of surface area has been impacted by the pipeline and the roads and the drill pads and so on. They're doing directional drilling like they do in Alpine. So they don't have to have as much of an expansive development as they used to have. But this shows that 2.5-mile buffer zone around the roads and pipelines. And interestingly, they only count those vertical support columns that hold up the pipeline. The pipeline itself isn't actually part of the development. Isn't that amazing? So it's the gravel road, it's the vertical support columns, it's the pad sites and some of that infrastructure. But you can see in this very compressed coastal plain, the impact on caribou is going to be pretty significant. And again, the extent of development on the North Slope has affected 1,000 square miles. That's about 10 or 15 years old data now, so it's bigger than that. But the gravel footprint only covers 10,000 acres. And these data come from the National Research Council report in 2003. They work with the National Academy of Sciences. So this is real stuff. Okay, we're going to shift gears from caribou and just talk briefly about birds. There are waterfowl, geese and ducks, there are shorebirds, and there are songbirds in the coastal plain. And interestingly, the water birds in NPRA are much more abundant and higher density than they are in the Arctic refuge. That's a golden plover and a nest of golden plovers. And interestingly, around the oil field infrastructure, just like in Anchorage, there's been an increase in ravens and an increase in glaucous gulls. We have glaucous winged gulls here. They have glaucous gulls up north, and foxes. And because of garbage and food left over and things like that, so an increase in predators of birds and bird eggs, nests, and so on. So this is something that's of concern, and the most recent information suggests that in the vicinity of oil fields, there's often been a decline in waterfowl, shorebirds, and passerine birds. I'm not going to touch a lot on that. We're going to move west to the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, 23 plus million acres. This is the largest block of public land in the United States. And this was designated by President Warren Harding in 1923 as the Naval Petroleum Reserve. And the mandates included conducting an oil and gas exploration and leasing program, protecting environmental and fish and wildlife historical and scenic surface resources from impacts, and assuring maximum protection for significant surface values, including subsistence use. So the NPRA clearly is a petroleum reserve. There's no doubt about it, and it's already producing product, and there's plan to do more exploration and development, but legally they're required to balance development with conservation. Busy map, but I just want to point out this is NPRA. It has very high wildlife values. To the right along the border of NPRA is the Colville River, which is the largest river in Alaska north of the Brooks Range. Up in the center top is the Teshik, and that's the Colville River is a special area that's been designated by BLM because of its wildlife and other values. Teshikpuk Lake in the upper center, that special area has very high value for the Teshikpuk caribou herd, which is the caribou herd that remains on the north slope and provides villages on the north slope with valuable subsistence resources. Teshikpuk Lake is the biggest lake in Arctic Alaska, and it has very high value for nesting and molting geese and waterfowl, yellow-billed loons, other species. And then the great big area down to the lower left is the Uticok uplands, and this is the calving area for the Western Arctic caribou herd that once numbered 500,000 animals. Teshikpuk Lake, an overview, the lake itself is north of this image, but you can see it just full of wetlands habitat. Yellow-billed loon, spectacle eider, brant, the molting area for black brant, I think in the world it accommodates about 30%, and then they fly north and west. And then the Teshikpuk caribou herd. This is an example of banding information where geese were banded in NPRA, mostly around Teshikpuk Lake, and they followed the band returns all around the country. Canada, the lower 48, Mexico, Russia. So this area is really important. Western Arctic caribou herd. This Western Arctic is, the uplands is important for grizzly bears, wolverine, caribou. This is the distribution of the Western Arctic caribou herd. In the top, the yellow area is the critical calving ground, the foothills of the Brooks Range, the Western Brooks Range. And then you can see the summer range in green, and then moving down through migration in the purple area is the winter range. And I may have mentioned this earlier, but 40 native villages in northwest Alaska depend on the Western Arctic caribou herd for subsistence. The Colville River is one of the most important raptor areas in the circumpolar Arctic, nesting peregrine and gyrfalcon, golden eagle, rough-legged hawks. And then, this is important. This is the 2024 NPRA rule, which revises the framework for designing and assuring maximum protection of special areas, significant resource values, and protects and enhances access for subsistence activities. So clearly, NPRA is an important oil and gas area. And there can be some development of that area, but there are also very high values for fish, wildlife, and birds, and subsistence. This shows the current oil and gas leasing along Alaska's North Slope. So the dark red is current state and federal leases. The slashed red bars are active federal lease areas. The crosshatched bars are active state lease areas. The tan area is native corporation land, just to give you an idea. So let's go all the way to the right, and you can see the black border between Canada and Alaska. You can see the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the coastal plain in tan, and that very small amount of at the Canadian border, moving along the coast to the Arctic Refuge coastal plain 1002 area, you can see a little bit of dark red. And that's protected in wilderness. It represents less than 10% of the Arctic coastal plain, of America's only Arctic coastal plain. And everything else is open to development. So this is a picture Mary Beth and I took a couple of friends up to the Arctic Refuge back in the 90s, camped out. We flew our own airplane up there, went to the Beaufort Sea coast, and Mary Beth's looking across the coastal plain of the Brooks Range. The Arctic is an amazing place. It's the only place in the United States where we have truly still some intact Arctic ecosystems with polar bears and bare ground caribou and amazing bird nesting habitat. And less than 10% of this area, which is kind of foothills, not so much coastal plain, to the very east of the Arctic Refuge is protected. And I'm a pragmatist. Oil and gas have brought great value to Alaska. There's no doubt about that. But this area also has tremendous value for subsistence use by people whose ancestors have been here for 10,000 years. It has great value to fish and wildlife. And doesn't it make sense that we would have a comprehensive conservation strategy in place before we piecemeal development of the whole coastal plain of our nation's only Arctic? To me, that makes sense. How do you manage development if you don't have a baseline of understanding of what the impacts of climate change are and the impacts of development and the combined impacts of those things? You need scientific control areas. So I think from a scientific level, just from the experimental control area standpoint in developing procedures and safeguards, that makes sense. But to develop piecemeal the whole coastal plain doesn't make sense to me. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there can be development. There is development. And we just need to do it in a smart way. So that's basically my take on conservation of wildlife resources in the Arctic. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. We can turn on the lights. Can we grab a light? This is, how many of you have been up to Prudhoe Bay or the Arctic coast? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About half of you. That's great. It's a really interesting place with, different kinds of values. And I think we have to be smart in how we develop those values and how we protect them. Any comments, suggestions, questions? Yes, that's absolutely the case, especially the males, the bulls. The females and calves tend to avoid infrastructure, but generally when the bugs really get going, you'll see caribou moving towards snowfields and hilltops that get wind, or they move right over next to the coast where they get the wind off the coast, because Having been up there, you know, when you eat lunch or you eat dinner and you're camped out, you're like a caribou. You walk into the wind, and there's a huge cloud of mosquitoes right behind your head. If you just stop, right? And if you stop, you're just surrounded by mosquitoes. And I mentioned the work that the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing on caribou with these video cameras around their neck, you know, and they're also tracking caribou with satellite collars, which, you know, is amazing the data you can collect. But they've identified that lichens in the summertime, we know that lichens are important in the winter. In the summertime, they're also using a lot of lichen. And then the cotton grass, the Eriophorum, you know, up there that has such high value. So yeah, caribou will move toward, you know, a gravel pad, you know, if you're a bull caribou. But if you're a cow caribou with calves, you know, they're much more sensitive to the infrastructure, especially if there's traffic on it. And this is research that's been developed in the last few years.
We have a question online.
Yes.
Roger, go ahead.
I don't know if you can hear me, can you?
Sure could, Roger. Go ahead.
Okay. When you were showing this, I typed a question into the chat, but I guess nobody was attending to it. You showed us a couple of maps regarding development and the debate between, you know, a couple thousand acres footprint and a much, much larger footprint of area where the cows and calves shied away from. And I just wanted to clarify, I'm not sure the point went across when you presented it, that all your maps of pipelines and drill pads and everything, there's nothing there. It's somebody's conception of what would be the most efficient way to exploit the resources if they went ahead with it.
Yes, Roger, that's absolutely the case. That coastal plain 1002 area is a hypothetical based on the condition that there be no more than 2,000 acres affected by development. So they didn't count the overhead pipeline, but they counted the roads and they counted the vertical support post. That's what they were trying to get. Again, hypothetical. There is no development in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge at this time. Thank you. Very good point.
And to follow up on that, is there potential for some kind of compromise on that? For instance, developing half of that grid and leaving the other half, you know, undisturbed. For instance, in approving the Willow project, the oil companies wanted to have 5 drill sites, and they were only approved for 3. It seems like the prospect of some kind of compromise isn't very encouraging because, like you pointed out, there the oil companies didn't even bid on the Anwar lease sale invitation.
Yes, that's right. I'm unaware of any compromise right now. My understanding is that the really big oil companies are keeping their distance. You know, Ada has committed $20 million. They want to keep the lease option available. You know, organizations are entrenched. You know, from the conservation groups on the one side of no development, it's a national wildlife refuge, but it was left up to Congress, and the interest in Alaska to develop it for economic gain in the short term. I don't think, to my knowledge, there's any discussion back and forth about compromise between those groups.
But of course, the government is offering this lease sale because it was mandated by statute, and that hasn't been repealed or changed. So they have to go through the motions.
Yes, that's right. It was part of the tax bill that there be 2 lease sales. They had one, very little interest. Ada, you know, bid on them, and then when Biden came in, he canceled that lease sale. Well, there's another lease sale that's still coming up that has to be done before the end of this year. And we don't know, what the status of that is yet. But the Arctic Refuge has been, in contention for a long, long time. I think of other interest, though, going to the west, the National Petroleum Reserve, as you pointed out, there is some compromise going on. That occurred over the Willow issue, and now this recent addition to the NPRA special areas and how they be managed, that's coming up. And it's, there have been public comments on that. So there is some level of compromise going on there. It is a National Petroleum Reserve. It also has valuable resources and subsistence values that are recognized. So it's trying to balance those two things. Sandy.
Right? There's clothing around the top,
I'm just
That's
curious
right.
about the ADA leases.
but you need to check them out.
Really
They're a little
intend
bit
to
more than
develop,
that.
to explore and develop on those leases? That's a lot of money just to.
Yeah, yes, it is. I think that, and I'm not an expert on this. If somebody has better information, you can feel free to jump in. But my understanding, when ADA bid on the first leases, they knew that the big industry wasn't going to bid, and that they were trying to keep the door open. So there were lease sales that ADA could have passed on or sold to somebody else. I don't think there was much interest in that, but they're keeping the door open because, like last week, I think they made that decision. Bob, I see you shaking your head, yes? Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's just a matter of keeping the door open for Alaska to bid on those areas. Why has there been so little interest by the big industry for the lease sales? And yes, it didn't from big industry. It drew interest from Alaska because Alaska oil and gas brings great value to Alaska.
You're on the
There are a couple things. Climate change. I mean,
You're
we
on
have
the
a commitment in this country to reduce fossil fuel use. And, I believe that climate change is happening, and I believe that it's going to be a real problem for my children and grandchildren in the future. So I'm supportive of moving toward recyclable energy, green energy as much as we can. And I think that the big finance companies, banks and so on, have recognized that, and they're kind of stepping back from financing some of these big industry efforts. Why Conoco or BP or Exxon or some of these companies, you have to ask them. But they've not really shown a lot of interest in the Arctic Refuge. They are showing interest in NPRA. I don't know if that helps answer that. I think there's been one exploratory drill in the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, and that's secret, but I think the thinking is that it didn't show much. I see yeah. But there's only been one. And, if we open that to development, you got the caribou herd, and I think all the caribou biologists, from the Canadians to the Americans, see that condensed coastal plain with a major oil field development is really impacting the porcupine caribou herd, which is now the largest herd in North America. And all the rest of the caribou herds, the barren ground caribou herds, are in decline, in some cases significant decline. And so there's concern about that, and the Gwich'in people in Arctic Village, just south of the Brooks Range, boy, they've had a very vocal interest with Congress and fighting against that. But the people, the mayor of Koktovik and the Arctic Slope Region Corporation, they're very much in favor of this. So, it's a mixed bag up there. But my understanding is that there isn't a lot of finance support in terms of financing major industry to go into the Arctic refuge. That's not the case with NPRA. Sandy?
I'll ask another one. You had a slide a few back about a comprehensive conservation plan. I can't remember. Is that underway or is that just
No.
your proposal?
No, I had two slides, one showing where the development is occurring and the leases that have been set aside, and then the next slide was a slide showing that little piece of the Arctic refuge next to Canada that is permanently protected in wilderness. And much of that little blip is foothills rather than coastal plain. But there's less than 10% of the entire Alaska coastal plain, Arctic coastal plain, that's permanently protected. That little blip on the Canadian border is protected. That's congressionally protected as wilderness. But there is no more wilderness. Now, the National Petroleum Reserve, Teshekpuk Lake Special Area, the Colville River Special Area, the Uticok Upland Special Area, and a few more, those are protected administratively, not congressionally. So those can be changed by a new president with regulations. So, less than 5 days from now, it's going to be a different ballgame. We're going to see, one administration that was focused more on conservation and renewable energy, and one coming in, that has questions about climate change.
What about on the Canadian side of that sort of hard line? Is there development?
There's some in the Mackenzie River Delta, but the Canadians generally and the Canadian indigenous people are strongly opposed to development of the coastal plain of the Arctic refuge, because the porcupine caribou herd, winters in Canada, in the Porcupine River, to some extent, and it's very important to the indigenous people of Canada. So the Canadians generally are not supportive of development. Any other questions? Yes. Well, that's a great point. And remember, lichens, I want to talk. Oh, the question was, there's a common understanding that lichens are used by caribou in the winter when there's nothing else available, and caribou lose weight eating lichens. Well, the brand new information out of the Arctic Refuge by the Fish and Wildlife Service, their research biologists looking at this, and they've used these video cameras in part, and they were seeing that, man, the caribou are eating a lot of lichens in the summertime. And they were using the cotton grass as well. And it turns out that lichens have quite a bit of value. And, in the wintertime, that's mostly what's available to barren ground caribou. And the caribou use their front hooves and they paw an open area under the snow, and then they feed on lichens. Two things about lichens. Hard to keep track of all of it. One, with climate change, well, two things with climate change, but one issue is that in Western Alaska in particular, and I've got friends that have studied caribou for years, Kotzebue and Barrow, and there are more and more rainstorms and warm weather coming in periodically in the wintertime. And when you have rain on snow, and then you get back to cold weather, it turns to ice. And Jim Dow in Kotzebue had a discussion with him in the last couple of months. And they've found that with the Western Arctic herd, there are places that are glazed over with ice, and they found major areas of dead caribou that have starved to death. They can't paw through the ice. And that's happening more and more commonly when you get these weather patterns moving in. So that's one thing. The other thing is with warmer weather, the Arctic is turning greener. And some of the botanists with Fish and Wildlife Service have seen, their satellite photos, and you can see it's called the greening. I mean, it's a term. And shrubs are coming in, and they're displacing some of the forbs, the annual plants like cotton grass and other things. And caribou don't really eat shrubs much in the summertime. And so losing habitat from displacement of shrubs for other plants. This is happening with Dall sheep too, on the Kenai Peninsula and elsewhere, as a result of climate change. The shrubs are moving up the mountains. So those are two issues that are related to climate change that are going to impact species like caribou or Dall sheep. Does that answer? So, any other questions? Bob, you've been up there. What did you think of Kaktovik? They don't have that opportunity anymore to see polar bears. That was pretty amazing, wasn't it? Yeah. And I think that we were out with Robert Thompson in his boat, and he's a real opponent of developing the Arctic Refuge. But then others, it's kind of a mixed bag in Kaktovik. There's, I don't know if it's half and half or if it's 75-25 or something, but some of the villagers really don't want to see that area in their backyard developed, and others see the economic benefits and do. And that's the corporations, ASRC, they're very much supportive of development up there because it's brought lots of money to the North Slope. Sandy.
So what's the forecast for, say, 10, 20 years out with climate change progressing on the North Slope for?
Well, I'm not a climatologist. I
Well, I meant in terms of wildlife.
I can give you some
projections.
guesses. Moose are advancing on the North Slope as willows come into the riparian areas along the rivers, shrubs. Beavers are moving north and west in places they haven't seen them before. Salmon are, colonizing some of the rivers and streams on the North Slope, mostly pink salmon, not, to my knowledge, not king salmon or some of the ones in the Yukon that are such of a concern. So I think we can see vegetation changes. I think we can see weather changes like the rain on snow turning tundra to ice. That's an issue. So, it's hard to predict, but I think songbirds nesting in the tundra with more shrubs, we'll see an impact on certain kinds of songbirds. So we're likely to see a lot of impacts. The International Arctic Research Center, that's where my son Eric works, and Rick Toman, who's had that one great graphic, and he puts out like a monthly update on snow and ice and sea ice and so on. And you could Google International Arctic Research Center, Rick Toman, and you could track that down. You can get an update like every week or month or something. Change is coming. I mean, Kotzebue. You saw the photos of Kotzebue, and one of the things on the coast, on that western coast, is that this time of year, often you'd be getting shore ice, and then when you have these big winter storms, it blows hard. But now we get those big winter storms with surge, ocean surge, and that's what's happening up there. And I think we're going to see villages having to move, costing millions of dollars. So climate change is real, and it's going to bring some real significant impacts to Alaska. And the Arctic is changing. I think climate change here is about 4 times faster than the global average in terms of impacts, temperature impacts in the Arctic. Big issue.
We have another question online.
Okay.
Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, when you mentioned that the Canadians were pretty unanimous in their opposition to the Anwar oil development because of its impact on the porcupine herd, which the populations there have uh, utilized. It brought to mind the fact that the cross-border issues are very difficult. One of the reasons there might be unanimity in Canada is that uh, if somebody makes a lot of money off of the oil in Anwar, nobody's going to be sharing it with Canadians. And the flip side of that is, the rivers, the big drainages in Southeast Alaska, where upriver the Canadians have developed mines that threaten the salmon resource that is utilized by the Alaska populations at the mouth of the rivers. And again, the Alaskans are pretty unanimous in worrying about that because they're not getting a cut of the action from the mineral development. It's the flip side of the issue.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's certainly the Canadian uh, mines on those transborder rivers is a really big issue for fish. Um, and just to be specific, my reference to the Canadians was more to the indigenous people and to the biologists that are studying that issue. You know, they're the ones that have spoken out most strongly opposed. And I don't know that there's a Yukon or Northwest Territories position or so on at the governmental level. But we do have an international treaty on the porcupine caribou herd with Canada. And, that's everybody's concern because that caribou herd has very high value to the indigenous people they call themselves the people of the caribou. Right, Roger, your point is well taken that Canadians aren't going to receive any financial advantage of developing the Arctic refuge. Yes. Yes, muskox. Um, There are the biggest concern about muskox like 2 or 3 years ago was the fact that grizzly bears on the Arctic slope had learned how to kill them. and muskox were starting to decline. And, muskox used to occur naturally, but they were extirpated by early whalers and people with firearms and so on. Then they were reintroduced to Alaska. Uh, so there are some concerns of muskox. But I haven't done any muskox work myself, so I can't, respond directly to that. Well, thank you very much for your interest and coming here in the snowy weather.